Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world today. And welcome to the first episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. And today we have the privilege to having someone very special with us to get started in this series and in these new episodes for realist researchers or people who are just interested in hearing about realist research. We have Geoff Wong with us. Geoff, how are you today?
Fantastic, Alejandro. Thank you very much for having me, and it's a real sort of pleasure to be here.
No worries. Thank you so much for being here, Geoff, and for particularly for our first episode of what is realist research, which I know a lot of people will be coming into this asking themselves this question, and hopefully we can give them a good initial introduction into what it is. I'm sure we will, and some practical tips at the end. Just for those who may be listening, Geoff, that may not have been involved with realist research in the past, would you be happy to introduce yourself and all the work that you've done for the realist community thus far?
Yes, sure. So, hi, hello everyone. So, my name is Geoff Wong. I'm Associate Professor of Primary Care in the Department of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford. I've been involved in this field of research, well, in this sort of form of realist research that I do for coming up to 20 years now, having originally done my own doctoral thesis actually on a realist project. So, yes, been doing this for a very long time and hopefully be able to share some ideas and help you to all start your journey.
Brilliant. Thanks, Geoff. We have a lot of people who are coming into this podcast, from a standing start in a way, and they may have heard of realist research, but they're unsure where to start. So, just as an initial starting point, how do you personally define realist research?
Okay, so it's a very good question, and I think may seem like a strange answer, but I don't think there's any one particular school of realist research. I think if anything, one of the big challenges that there are many different ways that people have used these sort of various ideas underlying realist research in order to make sense of the world around us. And if it helps, the sort of realist research from sort of my perspective would be the sort of realist research is defined by two key individuals really who've really brought this to the forefront, which is my colleague and Professor Ray Pawson, who's an emeritus professor of social research methodology at the University of Leeds, and then Professor Nick Tilley, who's emeritus professor of criminology at University College London. So these two gentlemen back in 1997 started off this sort of whole particular sort of school or tradition, which was realist evaluation. At the time, they called it realistic evaluation, although it's now pretty much called realist evaluation. And then in 2006, Ray Pawson's book, Evidence-Based Policy, A Realist Perspective, and that was the sort of almost seminal text for bringing sort of the secondary research version of realist research. So in a way, what I'm talking about, and I hope that it doesn't add to the confusion, the sort of school of type of thinking that I follow, and certainly I suspect many of my colleagues here who I work with have followed, is a school of sort of realist research as put forward by Nick Tilley and Ray Pawson, which is realistic evaluation or realist evaluation as it's called now, and then realist review or realist synthesis as it's also called. I think where it does sort of differ, where there's similarities, I mean, where all the sort of in general, and this is quite a generalization, most of the realists believe in this idea of generative causation. Yeah, so this is just a different way of thinking about causation, and that sort of sets it apart. So, what is realist research? One of the things is that people will subscribe to this idea of generative causation. I'll cover that a little bit in a minute. Um, and then other sort of above and beyond that, there are sort of, because you follow particular sets of schools or types of realist research, there are other sorts of concepts that come up as well, things like the use of program theory, things like the use of this idea of something called context mechanism outcome configurations, which is quite specific to the sort of realistic evaluation, realist review type of school. So difficult. I'm trying to cover those three things so that then at least you'll go away thinking where perhaps the differences will be. So generative causation is very much this idea that what we do doesn't necessarily make things happen. Rather than, the interventions that we do, the activities that we might do, certainly in research or in sort of social care or health or care programs, those don't cause things to happen. What those do, in fact, is they end up leading to changes in the world around individuals. Yeah, so we manipulate the world around individuals, what within the sort of realist evaluation, realist synthesis tradition would call things that function as context. And then the generative causation bit is is to bring in this idea of mechanisms. So it's got a very specific meaning. Mechanisms for realists doesn't mean, process. It means a specific thing. So it's usually and commonly defined as being context sensitive, hidden, and a causal force. Yeah. And it sounds a bit scary that, people say, oh, wow, we're basing an entire tradition or type of research on something which is hidden and it's context sensitive, but hidden being the most scary bit, I suspect. But the important thing is there are lots of things which we theorize about, which function as mechanisms for certain types of outcomes, which are hidden. To give a really good example that some of you, I suspect everyone is familiar with, is the force of gravity. That's a hidden context sensitive causal force. And it doesn't really bother anyone that, we have this thing that we conceptualize as being a hidden context sensitive causal force, which realists would call a mechanism, but yet we're able to use it and use our understandings of this to send rockets off into to deep space and off to Mars and off to the moon and wherever. So in that sense, that's one big thing that is very different. It's using this sort of idea of hidden context sensitive causal forces mechanisms that makes it really quite different from, I think, particular other types of research which may not have such a clear way of talking about causation. So this idea then of having this sort of mechanism leads on to this other sort of bit of jargon I used earlier on, which is context, mechanism, outcome configurations. And that's just like a sort of heuristic, like an aide-memoire, a way of trying to get people to think in configurations. So that's another thing that makes it different, rather than saying, this and that, and not having a link between them. For example, people might say, in complex interventions, things like sort of smoking cessation interventions and interventions to reduce people's blood pressure, those kinds of types of things. Those sorts of things, they're often called complex because there's lots of components to them. There's these components that seem to be acting in slightly different ways and non-linear ways. And there's lots of different types of outcomes. And there's lots of things that might function as context. Rather than saying, you've got this complex intervention, it's got contexts, and it's got these outcomes, and they all seem to be related. What this heuristic of a context mechanism outcome configuration is trying to do is to say, look, if you want to think like a realist, then what you need to do is you need to think in configurations. You can't just say, here's an outcome, here's a context. You can't just have a list of like barriers or facilitators or enablers or disablers of a particular intervention and then not link them together in some sort of configurational thinking. And Pawson and Tilley really do, in fact, that the latest book that Ray Pawson has written, which is How to Think Like a Realist, this is one of the big things, how to think like a realist. I mean, if there was a spoiler alert to that, it would be thinking configurations, right? And the idea here is that, you've got this thing, mechanism, the hidden context sensitive causal force. Well, then what is functioning as the context to activate this mechanism? And then that goes on to give you this outcome. So that kind of configurational thinking, again, adds to this idea of what is realist research, mechanisms, configurational thinking. And then the last sort of bit of icing on the cake, the last sort of elaboration to this is this idea of a program theory, not original to realist research, but Nick Tilley and Ray Pawson were both evaluators. So program theories are used in evaluation research. It's been brought from that evaluation for traditions. And one of the things that program theories do is they provide almost like a sort of overall explanation for these CMO configurations. So these causal explanations that take this particular form, that tell us about why certain outcomes happen. When it happens, that's for the contextual bit. And why, that's the mechanism bit. These are all stitched together into a program theory. So program theories provide us both a theory of change. How does change happen? Yeah. And often they're also a theory of implementation, because by elucidating what types of contexts are available or what type of contexts are needed to get the outcomes you want, you start being able to identify where it is that your different interventions that manipulate this context, where do they sit within all of this mess that we're looking at, this sort of massive complex intervention. So I hope that's given you some idea of what it is. I mean, it's a very, very quick trot through decades of work and also quite a lot of theory that's brought in and lots of different practices and ideas and concepts that have come from a whole range of researchers, from philosophers all the way through to evaluators and other realists as well. And I think one of the useful things you might want to do, if you want to sort of see where all these potentially have come in, is the Science of Evaluation. Is the book. It's the sort of third book by Pawson that has some overview about that as well. But his latest book does as well. Right,
Well,
Alejandro, over to you.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that really comprehensive whistle-stop tour, as you say, onto a definition of realist research within realist evaluation and synthesis, as you mentioned, of Pawson and Tilley. I guess that this links really nicely to the second question, and I guess we've covered it in that one as well, which is what distinguishes realist evaluation and synthesis from other types of evaluation or research. And I guess that if we were to summarize from the points that you made earlier, is this concept of generative causation, the role of mechanisms in the way that they are defined in realist research. And of course, they are defined in different ways. And we will see that in a new episode of this podcast. The configuration of context, mechanisms, and outcomes, and this concept of program theory as well, or the overall explanations into how and why something is happening or working, or indeed not working. Would that be a fair reflection, or is there anything else that we've missed?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair reflection. I think what is one of the philosophers that Pawson and Tilly have drawn on is a chap called Roy Bhaskar. And one of his calls very early on has been the need for ontology. So, right, what do I mean by that, and what in the world does that what's the implication of that, I guess, for kind of our research here? So the ontology is sort of an understanding of how the world must be constituted for science to be possible. In other words, we must have an understanding of how the world is before we can actually start doing some research about it and or doing research in it. Yeah. And so his call for this, like, we need to have this understanding. Yeah. So the example here is we need to have an understanding of why it is that things happen. Yeah. Rather than, for example, this idea of the intervention causing an outcome, the idea of the mechanism causing the outcome. That's very much from Bhaskar. So this need for ontology, I think that does separate realist research from many other types of research. Um, Not all researchers and in their research traditions or with their realist research or in their research methods are very explicit about their ontological basis. Yeah. So there's that element of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have an ontological basis. In terms of distinctions, realist research does have an ontological basis. There's all sorts of implications, which I'm sure you might want to cover later on in your podcasts about, what epistemological implications are, etc., of taking this realist ontological position. But in terms of taking this sort of almost sets of assumptions about how does the world work for research to be happening, yeah, there is a very distinct element to it. So if you are in a research project or you're involved in any of these and people start talking about realist ontology, you can stop them for a moment. You can have a quick chat about it. But I think there's not a vast amount you need to understand other than the fact that it does have this very distinct way of thinking about how the world works. And the most important element of that is that mechanisms are super important. Yeah, this idea of generative causation, that there are these hidden context-sensitive causal forces, which are only going to be activated under specific things that function as context to activate them. Yeah. So that idea is probably one of the things which is important. I think another aspect which does potentially make it slightly different is based on this understanding of how the world works, this ontology. The assumption is that most things will work for some people some of the time. Yeah, in other words, that there's no such a thing that's sort of like, it's not yes or no. It's almost all shades of gray, spectra continuums, so that, we wouldn't expect, for example, that an intervention will never work for anybody. We wouldn't expect that an intervention will always work for everybody. Most of the things are in a sort of gray area. And what we're trying to really understand is this sort of variation in impacts, these particular outcomes changing when the context is slightly different. And to do so, you have to understand this idea of mechanisms. And then the last point where I think there is a huge difference is certainly this is something which I found very interesting when I first ran across this back in 2004, 5. It's this idea of mechanisms. Realists go on about it all the time. People define it slightly differently, etc. But one of the important points about mechanisms, which is also something that's brought over from Bhaskar, which does again make it slightly different, is if you kind of look at a lot of our research, we have to wonder why it is that what we learn from one set of studies, participants, locations, areas, settings, you name it, right, would ever be transferable to anywhere else. Yeah. So this is actually a huge problem in research, right? Because, we have our funders, we have our public giving their basically their hard-earned cash towards national funders and things, and then expecting us to do research in particular areas, and then expecting that somehow to potentially benefit them. Fair enough, right? That's what we should be doing. But the big challenge then is, why would it be, right? Now, that's where being a realist can be very helpful, because if you believe in one of the other properties of mechanisms, which is that they're enduring liabilities of things or people, yeah, then that provides a warrant, a rationale, a reason for why it is that, look, if this mechanism is operating here in these particular areas where I've done the research, but it's also operating in these other areas where I'm now planning to apply this program or this intervention, yeah, then that's the warrant for transferability. It's because we are dealing with the same mechanisms. Yeah. And just to give you, going back to I always use the basic science examples are super easy, things like sort of gravity. Going back to this idea of gravity. Gravity is everywhere in our known universe. Yeah. It therefore fulfills the definition of a mechanism. Therefore, we would expect this theorized context sensitive hidden force to be something that we can operate, whether or not we're trying to send a rocket ship, to circle the Earth in order to, do whatever, drop a satellite off or whatever, or whether we're trying to send something all the way out to Pluto. We're still using the same theory. We're using the theories about a context sensitive causal force, which is transferable. It is occurring everywhere in our known universe. Now, it doesn't mean that we are absolutely right that this is the case. I think it is completely sensible that we should be potentially quite skeptical about whether it is. We should definitely try and be researching it or evaluating it by collecting data to confirm that our inferences, our educated guesses that this is happening is also true. But for me, it's a really lovely way of being able to have a nice, clear rationale for saying, yes, we've only done the research in these areas, we've only done the evaluation in these areas, we've only understood the phenomena in these areas. But actually, we have a warrant, we have a really good reason to think, and we will test out that we are right, that this is also transferable to other parts. And I think this is where there is a huge potential benefit for individuals, for society, and also for researchers, let's be honest. Okay, hope that's helped.
That's absolutely, Jeff. Thank you so much. And I guess that it adds as well to the understanding and the beauty of realist research, as you say, and some of the questions and some of the value and impacts that it can have for many people. And I guess that we've been speaking around the definitions and some of the key concepts, some of the key pillars of realist research and what makes it slightly different. But of course, with all this information, then in the world of research or evaluation, then we have to go into the field for a realist evaluation or for a realist synthesis, a realist review, go and search for some literature or grey literature as well. I guess that based on all that and on all the 20 years experience that you've had with realist work, what are some examples, or you can pinpoint some ideas to start a realist project smoothly with all these ideas around generative causation and mechanisms and program theory? How does one go on to then start a realist project?
Yeah, this is it's a really, really good question. And I think this is where we start to make a distinction between stuff which is very specific to realist things and stuff which is just specific to, which is kind of general and sort of generic and applies to any kind of research project or evaluation type project. I think my first step would be that I think you do have to have a sufficient understanding of what in the world is realism and realist evaluation, realist review, etc. So I suspect very simply there's no substitute for reading, just to get some idea. I mean, there are mixed opinions about how accessible some of the books are and etc. and some of the texts are, but I think in terms of the sort of a good starter article, it's a book. It really would be Pawson's How to Think Like a Realist, his most recent book, which came out in 2024 rather. I think it's written in a way where there's an appreciation of the fact that everybody doesn't come from the same background. It's written in a way which very slowly, step by step, in quite a few small chapters, provides a sort of breakdown of, what is the problems, why is it that you might want to end up using a realist approach? Yeah. So there's that. There's no substitute for reading. And I think people are going to find the resources that they like. And, I don't think you have to read all the resources. I think you can try and read some of the stuff. Some of the philosophical texts are slightly more difficult to access and understand versus others. So that's the thing, first one, do some reading. I think secondly, with any sort of project, it's get to, it's a little bit like sort of, Ocean's 11 or the A Team. You've got to get together a good team. Yeah. And the good team will consist usually of content experts, yourself, obviously, an individual who may be a content expert, etc. But I would suggest you get yourself a good realist methodologist, not one that talks in cryptic languages, that doesn't seem to quite be able to understand X, Y, or Z or explain things to you, but, kind of a really accessible person. And I think, if I was to sort of jokingly say, you kind of know they're a really good realist methodologist because they can explain to you Bhaskara's laminated system, right, in nice, plain, simple English. Now, you can go and read about Bhaskara's laminated system, but in a way, it is kind of almost like the sort of underlying realist ontology. And the people who really know what they're talking about have spent enough time to understand how to explain that to someone and why it matters. So maybe you could use that as a trick. But yeah, definitely get yourself a good realist methodologist. And if you want to be really sure that they're a good realist methodologist, you can check out their CV or their publication lists, right? If you've done one realist review, you're probably one chapter ahead of the individual that they're one chapter ahead of you. So I think that would help. Yeah, so get together a good team because you've got to be able to work as a team. One of the things that definitely happens within a team is it's a good, safe, psychologically safe space to have a good bit of disputation. Yeah, where people would discuss the analysis, discuss the various directions, etc. And be humble enough from everybody to be able to say, well, you know what, that's a really good perspective. We need to change our minds, etc. So get together a good team, and that I think is generic to any research project. It's not not specific to a sort of realist project. So you read, you get lots of theory, you get a good team with a good realist methodologist, and effectively that's where you're operationalizing your theory into practice. They can help you with all sorts of stuff. And if they're approachable, you'll be able to get them to help you with, for example, things like searching, for example, things like, data analysis, how you move from raw data through to actually producing CMO configurations, through to producing a sort of program theory that actually makes sense to somebody, all the way through to dissemination, how these things are disseminated. So get a good team and then get a good methodologist. And then the other thing is don't give up, right? Because you'll put in a realist project and no one will say, yeah, we're going to fund it immediately. Yeah, I think this is quite generic to research as well. If you've got a good idea and you've got a good team together as a team, I mean, we have sometimes put in projects 4 times before we've had them funded, right? So it's like, just be super stubborn. If you've got a good idea, you've got a good team, and you're stubborn enough, you're eventually going to hopefully get there. And then with the good team and your reading and everything, then you can actually deliver that project, and it becomes hopefully a sort of upward spiral and a self-fulfilling prophecy of getting further grants, etc. I haven't got much else to say other than that, but if I do think of anything else, I'll add it later on.
Please, thank you so much. And I think that's a really clear step-by-step guide to get started, at least in that journey, which for many people it is a journey of discovery, of learning, and then of a lot of light bulb moments, so to speak,
Yeah.
as you're going through a realist project. But I guess as well, we're talking here along the lines of, the ideal scenario where everything's going smoothly. But I'm sure that throughout your time, you have also seen researchers trying to undertake a realist project, but there must have been some common misconceptions or common pitfalls that you may have seen for realist research. So, what do you see as some of the most common ones from your experience if someone is starting with their realist journey now to potentially avoid?
Okay, so I think if you're I mean, first of all, you want to make a decision as to whether or not you want to start your realist journey. I think that's actually quite an important first step. And I do this quite frequently when I speak to people. And I'll be saying to them, look, be strategic about this, right? I mean, is it, if you're, for example, if it's going to be part of your PhD, yeah, and I'm thinking of using a realist something for my PhD, then the first question might be, well, I've got 3, if I'm lucky, 4 years, right? You're going to have to unlearn and relearn quite a bit. So there is definitely, for myself included, lots of unlearning. Yeah, where it's kind of like, well, I made these assumptions about how things are done, and well, it's slightly different, etc. So, a good example with this would be, the different ways by which some might, for example, check, assess rigor within a realist review. There are very, very different ways of doing these things between, a current systematic review and also within the realist synthesis. So is it an investment you want to make? Now, some people make the investment because they can actually see this is what I've been waiting for in terms of a way, a typical sort of scenarios might be because actually they've done research in other areas and found that it's not given them the types of answers that they've want. They've done research in certain areas and then found that actually someone else said to them, why don't you do a realist review or evaluation? And they think, well, that's a really good idea. Let me have a look about it. Yeah. So I think if you know this is what you want to do, then it's worth it. If you are not sure, then it may be worth just making sure you talk to a few more people to make sure that it is where you want to go, because it is a journey. It's sometimes a steep learning curve, and there's lots of relearning, lots of unlearning of stuff as well. So that's that element. The other thing to think about is yourself. What kind of a researcher are you? Some people love the sort of messy, it's investigative, it's sort of almost like a detective story. You're chasing down leads, you're slowly uncovering things, you're using different sort of data sources in order to make sense of a phenomenon, an intervention, or a program or something. Yeah, and some people love this sort of messiness. I mean, in a lot of the projects we work on, we sometimes wonder where in the world are we going, right? And then oddly enough, it always comes out in the wash. It always somehow happens because through enough thinking, through enough going through the project again and again, looking through the data, through discussion within the team, goes back to having a really good team with a nice, safe psychological space for everyone to be able to put their opinions across. So within that, then you start making some progress. But you got to like it. If you want to follow a protocol, if you want to say like, where's the cookbook? Start at A, finish at D. Yeah, it's probably not the type of research for you. So kind of think about that maybe yourself. Is it worth my investment? What, is it going to give me the art that, is it going to answer those types of questions I really want answered? And then secondly, is this the kind of research I even like to do, right? Because if it isn't the kind of research you like to do, then maybe not. Yeah. So there's those 2 elements. Then I think the other bits are just make sure you can be as educated as much as possible. Yes, not everyone's going to have their realist methodologists, etc. And a sort of, I wouldn't say it's not a second-rate substitute, but it can be a very useful substitute. Is to build a little community of practice. Yep. So there's a group of individuals of you who can sit together and have this disputations, right? Because quite a lot of it, this is actually something that's within that Pawson and Tilly drew on. This sort of Donald Campbell's idea of the disputatious community of truth seekers. Yeah, we don't know necessarily that any of our findings are actually necessarily true or a close reflection of what's going on in the world around us. But one of the ways we can get there is through disputation. Yes, we need data as well, but we also need the disputation within our interpretations of these data. So having that little team of individuals, which I think could be a project team, or if you're a PhD student, it's like maybe forming a group with many of your other people. Maybe you can find 2 or 3 other people. And the great thing this day about the sort of, in a way, the normalization almost of virtual meetings and virtual groups is they don't even have to be next door in your institution. They could be 400 or 500 miles away, could be on the other side of the planet for all it matters. But you may have commonalities because of your profession, because of your topic area, because you've all worked on previous projects before, or you know them just personally. Having that ability to dispute really helps to share CMO configurations, discuss them, to see maybe there are different ways of doing that. So that's another sort of really big useful tip. And we certainly find that some of our face-to-face meetings or even virtual meetings where we discuss data are where we will often make the most progress. And then I think my final one is don't try and speak in tongues in confusing language to people. right? Yes, we all have jargon, but the whole point about the jargon is so that we all understand what we're talking about. So I think if you do run across anybody, make sure everyone is speaking the same jargon. We all mean the same thing by program theory or mechanism, but also to not sort of, basically throw jargon at people and expect them to understand. I think one of our jobs, certainly certainly I see my job as a realist methodologist is to try and make things as simply as possible to everybody. Yeah, because we don't want to exclude anybody. We want people to understand. We're not here to make anyone feel silly because they don't understand what a mechanism is, right? The idea is we're all on the same team. We're all trying to get to the same place. We don't need to speak in language which is obfuscating exactly what's going on. Yeah, so having that sort of element of stuff, as having that sort of position to start off with, can be really helpful.
Well, Geoff, I thank you so much for all those different points, and particularly that last one. I think you've encapsulated exactly the reason of the realist lens, and what we're trying to do here with this conversations to ensure that realist work and realist research can be accessible to people from all stages of their academic careers and from all sectors as well. I guess just to end this really useful conversation to get us started in our podcast would be your top three things for someone to just get started practically. We mentioned in three to start a research project, but if someone was to go out of this podcast right now and go back to their day-to-day job or day-to-day life, and what would be the three things that someone could do to get started with the realist journey?
Right. So, I mean, just to say, I definitely don't get any commissions from Ray Paulson from this. I would think his latest book, How to Think Like a Realist, an excellent choice to start. Yeah, it's probably the most accessible of the books. It's pretty engaging. It's relatively short chapters. So do some reading. Yeah. Once you've had a chance to do some reading, obviously depends what I fully appreciate that I'm talking from the perspective of being a researcher, but from my perspective of being a researcher, then it's starting to see whether you can find anyone else who's interested in your topic area, right? So that you can start building a little bit of a team together. So that would be the sort of next step that I would suggest you try and do, get a bit of a team together. And then the sort of final one, which may be slightly different from the other ones that I said. So one of the big temptations in realist projects, and if you start developing these program theories, these sort of explanations of complex phenomena, is program theories are often absolutely enormous. They're just absolutely vast. They have no natural boundary. Yeah. And what we do, in fact, is we artificially put these boundaries around them. So don't try and do too much, right? So kind of think of it a little bit like a job creation scheme for yourself. Yeah. So let's say you do a review, realist review, obviously. Only now, of course, Geoff would tell you do a realist review. Yeah. And then you find that there are these areas which you need to explore. That becomes the beginning of a programmatic area of work. And this is where the sort of stubbornness comes in as well. If you've got this idea, you've done the review, you've got your team, try not to do like everything. Don't end up with a project that's utterly unfeasible, because you will just be making, a rod for your back, be shooting yourself in the foot. It's making things way too hard for yourself. You're way just better off just going, right, let's cover this beautifully. Let's do this bit well, and then move on and move on and move on and identify the different areas that might be that need future research. Yeah. So like get yourself some reading so you know what you're doing, get yourself a team. And then when you've got a project, don't try and do too much. Yeah. And enjoy the journey. I mean, finally, I think, yes, research is a tough environment. It's super competitive. It can be dog eat dog, yep, etc. But hopefully it'll be intellectually stimulating, because I think that's one of the few times when people have said to me, right, one of the nicest things about realist types of research is it does make you think. It does make you exercise your brain rather than you're following a cookbook, almost like a robot following a recipe. Yeah. So do enjoy it, and hopefully you'll get some benefits both for yourself and also for patients and the public and society, etc.
Well, Geoff, on that note and on the impacts that we're trying to make as realist researchers and through the enjoyment of the process and the journey, we are going to just for now end our conversation, but I'm sure that we'll have you soon at some point. And I really appreciate all the time and all the really clear and engaging explanations that you've given to everyone today to get started on the realist journey. And also thank you everyone for listening in to the Realist Lens. Geoff, thank you so much for your time, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.